Hang on, let me come back to it because it's just too beautiful. Look at this. Gorgeous, gorgeous table. Wow.
This was a fun project for me. A new client was looking for a large coffee table and liked the look of some of my other furniture. We went through some hard requirements and she sent over various images with design aspects she liked. Before I knew it, I opened my email and there was a PDF with a 3D model design for a table she had made. It contained all the necessary information I would need to create a parts list and to build a table. After examining the document, I explained a few concerns I had about wood movement and how I felt we could handle them. She was excited to dream up a design, and I was excited to make it come to life before her eyes. We had settled on solid ash for the entire table, and I let the wood acclimate for a few weeks before beginning. I went through the milling process twice to let the wood rest between planing. In order to minimize the number of joints on the tabletop, I flanned 8-inch wide boards on my 6-inch jointer by using a technique of basically cutting a large rabbet onto the boards and then pass them through the thickness planer over a sled. It was worth the extra effort to reduce the number of glue joints. Once milled, I spent a considerable amount of time orienting the boards in order to try and blend the joints and balance the grain patterns. Taking some time here will separate a great panel from a mediocre one. I flip boards over and around and move them back and forth like a 3D game of Tetris until I was happy. After I settled on an orientation, I marked the boards with the woodworker's triangle and started labeling the boards at the glue joints with an in and out. This is a simple technique where you run the inside against the joiner fence and the outside away from the joiner fence. This cancels out any deviation in the fence between the adjoining boards and helps create a tighter and square glue joint between the boards. I was pleased with how the joints looked on dry fit, so I laid out markings for the dowels I would use to keep the boards aligned during the glue up. When doing this, it's important to lay out the final dimension of the tabletop and ensure you don't put any dowels in the area you plan to cut. Nothing will ruin your day like cutting your top to size and slicing right through the middle of a dowel or domino. Thanks to these alignment dowels and planning out my clamping strategy before beginning the glue up, the tabletop assembly went smoothly. The glue was spread and all the parts came together tightly. Usually, I would do this glue up part in 2 parts, but I felt confident with how the dry fit came together and just went for it. With our top clamped and set aside to dry, it was time to focus on gluing up our leg blanks. These legs would be simple 3-inch by 3-inch square posts. After rough cutting to length, I milled each section of leg and then ripped it down the middle. This allowed me to fold the legs from the same piece of wood and resulted in a book match on one side of each leg. The next day, I could focus on bringing these legs to final dimension. I milled the blanks and made sure to remove equal material from each side. I wanted to make sure that the glue joint stayed on the middle of each leg, since the end grain would be visible from above. With that visual in mind, I oriented the legs in a manner I felt was most attractive and marked the tops so that I could recreate this layout at any time. This was also important as it would soon be time to recut the joinery for the aprons and stretchers. Speaking of the aprons, I milled those pieces out of some 4/4 and cut them to final dimension. With the aprons and legs cut, I began laying out dowel joinery for the apron to leg connection. Since the tabletop would be sitting flush with the top of the legs, I set my combination square to the thickness of the tabletop and marked the step on the legs. This is the position that the top of the apron should be once it is assembled. Then, using my Jessam dowel jig, I cut the required holes in each apron. I reset the jig and shifted the fence over by 1/2 inch. The table design called for the aprons to sit 1/2 inch back from the face of the leg, and moving the fence on the jig would create this reveal. I set the jig on each leg, making sure everything was oriented correctly, and drilled the mating holes. This process went quickly and dry assembly confirmed that everything was placed in the correct location. With the initial part of the base complete, it was time to turn my attention to the slatted shelf. I began by ripping a milled piece of 4/4 ash to the exact width of my doweling jig. My game plan was to slide the jig along the piece of wood and drill the 2 outside holes on each side. Once I had all the holes drilled, I could rip the piece of ash into 2-inch strips. This would result in 2 stretchers with the dowel holes being drilled in the exact same spots on both pieces. Before I could get to drilling, I needed to lay out the locations of the slats and therefore the dowels. Thanks to the 3D model, I knew that these slats were spaced 1.75 inches on center. With that information, I made reference lines along the piece at 1.75-inch increments. I also left the piece of ash long as I planned to cut it to length after drilling the holes so that I could ensure an even amount of material on each end past each set of dowel holes. Check by this. I clamped a piece of scrap as a positive stop along one edge of the board and then aligned the doweling jig with the first set of holes. I drilled those out and slid the jig onto the next set. Once I had these first two sets drilled, I was able to figure out what size of spacer I could use in order to just reference the previous set of dowel holes against the jig. This made this part of the process go quicker, and I ensured accuracy by checking each time I moved the jig that it aligned with my initial layout markings. I used a brad point bit to make sure that I was lined correctly. With our joinery drilled, it was time to cut each individual stretcher from the single board. The board was ripped to width, making sure to flip the board and reference the outside edge each time. I determined the locations for an even reveal on the ends and cut the board to length. Ensuring these stretchers matched the length of the aprons above was critical. A mistake after drilling all those holes would have been painful to accept. The base was coming together nicely, but there was a repetitive task ahead. It was necessary to mill all the shelf slats to the correct size, cut them all to the same length, and drill 4 holes in the end of each of them. There was nothing to do but to put on some music and get to work. My body went into autopilot while my brain started worrying about the most difficult part of the project just around the corner. I had been dreading this glue up since I initially saw the design. I've glued up a lot of slatted shelves and furniture over the years, but this was by far the largest both in number of pieces as well as sheer size. In hindsight, I should have not used regular wood glue. Some slow set glue or some epoxy would have given me some extra working time. Luckily, I was able to move truss fast enough to get the clamps on in time so that the joints came together tightly and with only minimal swearing. In order to minimize how many joints I needed to deal with at once, I first glued a dowel into each hole of the stretcher. I had 2 things in mind: make sure the dowels are set fully, and don't put so much glue that there's an excessive amount of squeeze out. With slatted furniture, squeeze out will save you cursing the day you decided to become a woodworker. Trying to clean excess glue from tightly packed inside corners is an exercise in patience like none other. With the easy part out of the way, it was time to move on to the main event. I had a game plan: move as fast as possible without breaking or denting anything. I started on the table, but soon realized I would be better off building off the floor. I upgraded to a steel hammer and made sure to use a sacrificial block so I didn't destroy the painstakingly made slats. As I assembled, I realized quickly that I needed some clamping pressure as soon as possible to stop the joints from sliding back apart. I grabbed the other stretcher and then did my best to align 19 free-floating slats. A second, or maybe third set of hands would have been indispensable here. After struggling, fiddling, bending, and smashing, the dowels aligned, the clouds opened up, and the piece slid into place. I was still under a time crunch. I grabbed my strongest pipe clamps and began applying pressure to close these glue joints up while I still had time. I'm convinced that if not for the astronomical amount of pressure these clamps are capable of producing, I would never have gotten these joints closed. It was done, and I don't think I had ever been more happy for a glue up to be finished, especially since I had smashed my finger during this one. With the majority of the building complete, it was time to move on to cleanup and prep. I needed to add roundovers where necessary, remove squeeze out, sand, and just overall clean and prep as much as I could before I assembled the base for the last time. This was not the sexiest part of woodworking, but arguably one of the most important. Satisfied that I had done as much as I could, I cut a couple last minute slots in the upper aprons to hold my Z-clips and then began to glue up the base. I wanted to get this all done in one shot so that I could ensure everything dried flat and square. It was critical that I planned out my path and made sure that I glued everything in the right order. Luckily, after the 21-piece shelf glue up, this one felt like a breeze. As I narrate, I realized that at some point I drilled a couple holes in the ends of the shelf stretchers as well as on the legs to hold the shelf. I'm not too sure where that footage ended up, but it was done in the exact same manner as the top aprons. I got the parts together and clamped everything, making sure that I used some sacrificial pads between the workpiece and the clamps. I paid special attention to the squareness of the table and utilized a ratchet strap to bring the top of the base into perfect alignment. This was not the time to let up and allow a small oversight to ruin the project. It's at this point on most table projects you're just about done. Typically, you just need to cut the top to length and apply finish. This project had one more detail, which meant the home stretch was still a little bit away. I began by cutting two sides of the tabletop at a perfect 90-degree angle. Then, I took the base and laid it onto the tabletop upside down and nestled it directly into the corner of our freshly cut, perfectly square corner. Since I had taken extra care to ensure a square base, it required only the smallest amount of shifting to bring them into alignment. I clamped down the base to the top and then used a straight edge to mark the remaining two sides of the top so that they would be flush with the legs. A circular saw with a guide made quick work of bringing the top down to size, and then it was time to bring the base back so that we could mark out the cuts for our corners. In order to get a perfect fit, the base itself was used to lay out where the corners needed to be cut. To account for some wood movement, spacers were added around each leg, and then some scrap plywood was glued directly to the bottom of the tabletop. These scraps would become our edge guides for our router so that we could cut a perfect reveal around each leg. The bulk of the material could be removed with the jigsaw. This technique is what I use whenever I need to perfect fit or reveal. By referencing the base itself and not just measuring in 3 inches or so for each leg, we're taking into account any deviation from imperfection that the base may have. A pattern bit with a bearing guide made quick work of the cutouts, and I was sure to label the table and top so that it would go back together in the exact same way each time. Now, we're on the home stretch. The top slid into the base with perfect reveal of each leg. A few more roundovers, a bit more sanding, a last-minute center support addition, and we're almost ready for finish. I did decide to lay out and pre-drill all the holes for the Z-clips that I would be using to attach the top to the base. These are one of my favorite ways to attach tops, and this case was no exception. I planned out some slots beforehand with the table saw, but a biscuit joiner works well in this situation as well. It's one of the only times I still use one. Finishing the project went smoothly. We were using Rubio 5% white as it did a good job of maintaining the natural colors of the ash. The top was very straightforward and the application was typical. As for the base, it was a meticulous process that just took time. I would apply finish as far as I could for about 10 minutes, then wipe it off. The saving grace is how forgiving Rubio is in terms of not leaving lap marks. It took some time to work the finish into all the slats, but the final product speaks for itself. Family and friends fell in love with the table when I showed them pictures, and I was tempted for a minute to keep it for myself. The client came to pick the table up a week later, and she was ecstatic to have had her vision come to life. I was ecstatic to see her so happy. I wish her many years of cold drinks, board games with friends, and laughter around the table. Thanks for watching.